I went hunting alone that October, back in 2017. I was 32 then, and it was my first solo hunting trip in almost 6 years. I'd been busy with work, city noise, and endless traffic, and I missed the quiet. I picked a spot in northern Montana, near a place called Swan Creek. The land stretched wide and cold, covered in yellow pine and fir, with hills that rolled into thick forest. It was remote enough that I didn't expect to see anyone else. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove my old Ford up a dirt road until the tires started to slip on the soft mud. I parked near a clearing, unloaded my gear, and walked deeper into the woods until I found a flat spot near a small stream. The sound of water moving over stones was steady, almost calming. The air was sharp, dry, and the light came down through the trees like thin golden lines. Felt perfect. By evening, I had the tent up, a small fire going, and a piece of jerky in my hand. I was relaxed in a way I hadn't been for months. The forest had that kind of quiet that presses against your ears, where every small crack or rustle seems amplified. I remember thinking how alive the silence felt out there. The first night went easy. I woke once to the sound of something moving near the stream, maybe a deer or raccoon. The next morning, I started my hike before sunrise. My rifle hung across my shoulder, and I moved carefully through the brush, scanning the slopes. I saw a few elk tracks, but nothing else. Around noon, I noticed something odd. A tree stump that had deep cuts in it, almost like someone had been hacking at it with a hatchet, but the marks were too fresh and uneven. I figured someone else had been camping nearby. Still, I hadn't seen another truck or person since I'd arrived. By afternoon, the wind started to pick up. The forest made that low, moaning sound when the gusts pushed through. I decided to head back before it got dark. My boots were heavy with dirt, and my back ached from the weight of my pack. When I reached camp, I noticed something that stopped me cold. One of the stakes from my tent was out of the ground, and part of the canvas was loose. It wasn't torn, just unhooked, like someone had undone it. I crouched and checked the area. The ground was soft, but I didn't see any clear footprints, just some scattered pine needles and disturbed soil. I told myself it must have been the wind. The weather had been shifting all day, and maybe a gust had pulled it loose. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as the daylight faded behind the trees. That night, I built the fire higher than before. The forest felt different, like it was holding its breath. Every few minutes, I'd hear a snap of a twig or the shuffle of leaves. Animals, I told myself again. There were plenty of them here. But then, a sound came that didn't fit. Something like a low cough, followed by the faint creak of movement, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. I froze. It came again, slow and quiet, but steady. Person's cough, not an animal. It stopped after a few seconds, and I sat there, staring into the darkness, the fire throwing flickering shadows across the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. I kept my rifle next to me, safety off. The cold air seeped through the fabric of my sleeping bag, and I stayed awake until dawn broke in gray light. The next morning, I felt drained and uneasy, but I told myself to shake it off. I'd come here to hunt, not to scare myself. I followed the ridge eastward, hoping to find better tracks. Around mid-morning, I saw smoke in the distance. Not far, maybe half a mile north. I stopped and looked through my binoculars. Through the trees, I could make out a thin column of smoke rising straight up, pale against the blue sky. Someone else was out here after all. I hesitated for a while, trying to decide if I should go check it out or stay put. It wasn't unusual for hunters to camp near each other, but something about that thin line of smoke made me uneasy. I decided to stay on my side of the ridge. I hunted a few more hours, got nothing, and headed back by late afternoon. When I reached my camp, the fire pit was cold, and the air felt heavier than before. Then I saw it. One of my gear bags had been dragged a few feet from where I'd left it. The zipper was open. Inside, some of my food was missing: jerky, a few protein bars, and one of my water bottles. The rest was untouched. It didn't look like an animal had torn through it. Everything was opened cleanly, like by hand. A tight chill went through my chest. I stood there, listening. Nothing but wind and the sound of the stream. I looked for footprints again, but only saw scattered mud and small indentations, too shallow to tell if they were boots or just erosion. I thought about leaving that night, but it was getting dark, and the road would be a nightmare in the dark. I decided to stay one more night and leave at first light. I made no fire that evening. I sat in the dark, my back against a tree, watching the outline of my tent through the dim light of the moon. The forest moved around me. Branches creaked, leaves whispered. But beneath it all, I started to hear something else. Slow steps, not steady like an animal, but deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. They were faint but clear. I held my breath and gripped the rifle across my lap. The steps came closer, maybe 20 yards away, maybe less. Then they stopped. The silence stretched so long I started to think I'd imagined it. Then came the sound again, something brushing against the fabric of my tent. Soft, slow. I didn't move. My chest felt like it was being squeezed. I waited, listening. A shadow moved across the tent, tall and thin. Paused there, perfectly still. Then the shape turned, and I heard soft movement fading away into the woods. I sat there until the first light touched the trees. When the sun rose, I packed fast. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped one of the tent poles. I didn't stop to eat, didn't even take down the fire pit. I threw everything into my pack and started walking fast toward the truck. Half a mile from camp, I found something that froze me where I stood. On the trunk of a tree near the trail, someone had carved a small X with a knife. It was fresh, the wood beneath still pale and raw. I looked around. Another X was carved into another tree about 20 yards farther down. Then another. A trail of them, leading roughly in the same direction I was heading. I forced myself to keep walking. The forest felt like it was closing in tighter with each step. My mind kept spinning. What if someone had been watching me since that first night? What if they'd marked where I'd been, or where I was going? When I reached the clearing, I saw my truck right where I left it, but the driver's side door was open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it. The seat was pushed back, and my glove box was open. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been searched. Maps, papers, even the flashlight. Whoever it was, they'd gone through my things and left it like that on purpose. I didn't wait. I started the engine, floored the gas, and didn't look back. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't stop until I reached a motel an hour south. When I finally parked, I sat in the lot for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for anyone to be that deep in the woods, and no reason for someone to mess with me unless they wanted me gone, or worse. I never went back to that area again. A few weeks later, I read online about an old hermit who had been living off the grid somewhere in those mountains, breaking into camps for food and supplies. Some hunters claimed they'd found their camps disturbed too. Tents moved, food missing. Nobody ever caught him. Sometimes I still think about that shadow outside my tent, how long it stood there before walking away. Maybe he decided I wasn't worth the trouble, or maybe he was just waiting for me to fall asleep. Either way, I never camped alone again. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through southern France. I was 26, had been working non-stop for months, and I just wanted a break. Something quiet, away from people, away from the usual noise. I rented a small car in Marseille and drove out toward a forested area near a small village called Saint-Laurent-du-Verdon. The plan was simple: spend a few nights in nature, hike during the day, and clear my head before heading back to my job in Lyon. The drive there was peaceful. The roads were narrow, winding through farmland and small hills covered with thick pine and oak trees. By late afternoon, I found a small dirt path leading deeper into the woods, far enough from the village that I wouldn't run into anyone. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat, dry, and near a small stream that trickled through the rocks. I parked my car on the edge of the path, carried my tent and gear about 50 meters in, and set everything up before sunset. That first evening was perfect. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of the stream mixed with the soft hum of crickets. I cooked a simple meal on my small gas stove, ate while watching the last bit of orange light fade between the trees, and then sat for a while just listening to the forest. Felt calm, the kind of calm that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. When it got dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and fell asleep faster than I expected. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I couldn't tell what time it was. My phone was turned off to save battery, and my watch was buried in my backpack. What woke me wasn't a sound, but a feeling. You know that heavy silence when your body just knows something's off? The forest wasn't making any noise. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I listened for a long time, eyes open in the dark, but heard only the faint movement of water from the stream. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. The quiet of the night could have been anything. Maybe the temperature dropped and the insects went silent. I spent the day hiking along a trail that went up a low ridge overlooking the valley. I didn't see anyone the whole time. No campers, no hikers. Just one small farmhouse in the distance, maybe a few kilometers away. When I came back to my site, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. That evening, I noticed something strange. Across the stream on the opposite side, there was what looked like an old fire pit, just a small ring of blackened stones and ash. I hadn't seen it the day before. Maybe I missed it. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but the ashes still looked dark, not bleached out like old ones. I remember staring at it for a while, wondering if someone else had camped nearby recently. When it got dark again, I built a small fire of my own, read a bit, and then went to sleep. I woke up again around 2 or 3 in the morning. This time it wasn't silence that woke me. It was a noise, footsteps, slow, uneven steps on dry leaves. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a boar, but the sound wasn't right. It was too steady, too slow, and it stopped and started like someone walking carefully, trying not to make noise. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound came from across the stream. I could tell by the crunch of twigs and the faint rustle of brush. Then it stopped. For a long time, nothing moved. Then I heard the sound again, a single step and then another, this time closer. I didn't move for maybe 10 minutes. The air felt heavy, my chest tight. I finally unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw something standing near the old fire pit across the stream. It was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or coat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see that his posture was strange. Not quite relaxed, not quite stiff. He just stood there, completely still, like he was listening. I froze. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My first thought was that maybe he was another camper, but something about it felt wrong. He had no light, no gear, nothing. Just standing there in the dark woods, staring. I watched him for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then he turned slowly and walked back into the trees, vanishing behind the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I sat inside my tent with my flashlight in my hand until the sky started to turn pale gray. When morning came, I packed my things fast. The ground near the stream was damp, and I could see faint footprints in the mud, large, boot-shaped prints that led from the opposite bank toward the trees. They were fresh. I thought about leaving right then, but a part of me told myself I might be overreacting. Maybe it really was another hiker passing through. So I decided to stay one more night, but move my tent a bit farther back from the stream, near a denser patch of trees. That day felt off from the start. The forest was too quiet. The sun was out, but it felt cold in the shade. Around noon, I went to collect some firewood deeper in the forest. That's when I found something that made my stomach twist. A piece of fabric caught on a low branch, dark green and torn, like part of a jacket. It looked old and dirty. A few meters away, there was a crushed tin can and what looked like the remains of a sleeping bag, shredded and rotting. I turned around and walked straight back to camp. I didn't even collect the wood. When the sun began to set, I sat by my tent with my small fire burning, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. The moment it got dark, I zipped myself inside the tent and stayed completely still. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement again. Slow steps, this time on my side of the stream. I held my breath. The steps got closer, and then I heard something brush against my tent. The sound of fabric dragging lightly. I could see the faint shadow of a figure through the thin material of the tent wall. Someone was standing right outside. I didn't move. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, shallow and steady. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow moved away. I waited until I couldn't hear anything at all. At dawn, I packed up in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even bother to fold the tent properly. Just stuffed it into the trunk and drove off. I didn't look back until I was back on the main road. When I stopped for gas in the village, the woman at the counter noticed how shaken I looked. I told her I had been camping nearby and had seen someone in the woods at night. Her face went still. She said something quickly in French to the man behind the counter, and he shook his head. Then she told me in broken English that a man had gone missing in those woods 2 years earlier. A local. They never found him. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, paid for the gas, and drove away. For a long time after that trip, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The man by the stream, the shadow outside my tent, the torn fabric in the trees. I still don't know who he was or what he was doing out there, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that tall, motionless shape standing in the moonlight, watching from across the water. And every time I think about camping again, I remember how quiet the forest was that night, how completely silent it became right before he appeared. It was in late September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to Northern Oregon. I had been working nonstop for months, and I just wanted a few days away from everything. No phone, no people, no noise. I picked a small, less-known forest area near Mount Hood, not too far from a lake I found online. It looked peaceful, the kind of place where no one would bother me. I drove up early that morning, the air getting colder the higher I went. The road narrowed into a single lane lined with tall pines that leaned slightly inward, like they were watching. I had my old gray tent packed, some food, a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, and a flashlight that flickered if I shook it too hard. It wasn't fancy gear, but it had always done the job. When I got there, the place was dead silent. Not the kind of quiet you get in parks. This was different. No distant cars, no planes, no wind. Just stillness. I found a flat clearing near the tree line and set up camp. The sun filtered through the branches, the smell of pine needles thick in the air. I boiled some coffee, unpacked my folding chair, and watched the lake. Everything looked perfect. By late afternoon, I decided to explore a little deeper into the woods. I followed a trail that was barely visible, more like a faded path people had once used. The ground was soft and damp, and I noticed the air getting cooler the further I went in. After maybe 20 minutes, I saw something strange. A small circle of rocks that looked placed, not natural. Inside the circle were a few burned logs, some half-melted beer cans, and a broken bottle. It looked like someone had camped there not too long ago. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. About 50 yards from that spot, I started noticing trash. Torn food wrappers, a ripped shirt, an old sleeping bag covered in dirt. The smell of something sour hung around. I stopped when I saw what looked like a pair of boots half buried in leaves. They were muddy, and one was tipped on its side, as if someone had left in a hurry. That was when I got this weird feeling in my chest. That tight, heavy kind of pressure that makes you feel watched. I turned around and decided to head back. I didn't want to get lost before dark. When I got back to my tent, the sun was already dropping behind the trees, the sky fading to orange. I cooked a small dinner, sat by the lake, and tried to shake off that strange feeling. I told myself it was probably just leftovers from someone's old campsite. By around 9 p.m., the temperature dropped fast. I zipped up my tent and got into my sleeping bag. I remember listening to the faint sound of water hitting the shore, soft and slow. But just when I started to drift off, I heard something. A snapping sound, like a twig breaking, came from somewhere behind my tent. I froze, holding my breath. Could have been an animal, deer, raccoon, maybe even a fox. I listened. Nothing. Then, another sound, heavier this time. A crunch like a boot pressing into dry ground. I felt my pulse in my neck. I turned off my small lantern, trying not to make a sound. The air felt heavier, colder. I lay still, waiting. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it again. Closer. Slow steps circling the tent. One step, then another. Soft, steady, deliberate. Not animal movement. Human. I could tell by the rhythm. I stared at the tent wall, seeing the faint shape of a shadow moving past. My breathing was so shallow I could barely hear it myself. Then, nothing. The sound stopped. I waited. 10 minutes, maybe. My whole body was tense. I was sure someone was out there. But when I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent a little and peek out, the woods looked empty. My flashlight flickered again, weak and unreliable. I scanned the area, nothing. Just darkness and trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump. I sat there, clutching my flashlight, waiting for daylight. When morning came, everything looked normal again. Birds were out, the sun cut through the mist, and it almost felt stupid to have been that scared. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and looked around. That's when I noticed something off near the trees. There were footprints, not animal ones, human. They went around my tent in a half circle, just like I'd imagined. The soil was soft, so the impressions were clear, deep enough to tell the person had been wearing heavy boots. They led toward the woods, but didn't come from the trail I'd used. It was like they appeared from deeper in the forest. My stomach sank. I packed my stuff quickly. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted to leave, but part of me wanted to see where those prints went, just to understand what the hell that person was doing out there in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail went about 200 yards into the woods and then turned sharply to the right. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks sticking out everywhere. After a few minutes, I came to another small clearing. And that's when I saw it, another tent. It looked old, dirty, and torn along the side. Next to it was a pile of trash. Empty cans, a rusted pan, scraps of fabric. The smell was strong, like something rotten. The tent flap was open, and I could see a sleeping bag inside that was stained dark brown near the edge. There was a small backpack leaning against a tree, half unzipped. I didn't go closer. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like I was looking at a place someone wasn't supposed to find. That pressure in my chest came back, worse than before. I turned around fast, and that's when I saw movement behind one of the trees. Just a small shift, like someone pulling back. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I turned and ran back toward my camp as fast as I could, tripping over roots, my bag bouncing against my shoulder. When I got back to my tent, I grabbed everything I could, threw it into my car, and started driving before I even buckled my seatbelt. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station about 40 minutes away. I sat there in the parking lot for a long time, just breathing. The station clerk came out at one point, probably wondering why I looked so messed up. I didn't explain. I just told myself it was done, that I was fine now. A few days later, back home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up reports from that area, missing hikers, strange activity, anything. I found a short article about a man who had been living off-grid in the woods near Mount Hood for years. Locals said he avoided people, stole food, and sometimes camped near the lake. There were a few reports of hikers spotting him from a distance, tall, scruffy, always wearing dark clothes. The article mentioned that rangers had tried to find him but never did. I don't know if it was him. I'll never know. But I keep thinking about those footprints around my tent. How close they came. How long that person must have stood there in the dark while I lay still, pretending to sleep. Since that night, I haven't gone camping again. I still like the woods. I drive past them sometimes. But I can't stand the thought of sleeping out there alone. Because when I close my eyes, I still hear those slow, heavy steps circling my tent. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had made one wrong sound. It was late September 2013. The air had started to cool down, and the forest near northern Idaho had that quiet, heavy feeling that comes right before winter sets in. I had been meaning to take a few days away from the noise of town, just to clear my head. I was 27 then, working nights at a warehouse, barely sleeping, and everything in life felt like a loop that wouldn't stop repeating. So, I packed up my old blue tent, my sleeping bag, a few cans of food, and my dad's hunting knife, and decided to camp near a place I had only heard about once. A small, overgrown area that used to be a family campsite in the 1980s. It had been closed for years after some kind of flooding destroyed part of the access road. I drove down dirt roads most of the way, my truck rattling over loose stones. After a while, the GPS gave up and I had to rely on an old printed map. The trees grew thicker as I went deeper, blocking out most of the sky. I passed a broken sign that said Larch Creek Campground, barely hanging on to its post. Everything beyond that point felt still, like the forest hadn't been touched in a long time. I parked near the edge of what used to be a parking lot, now covered in weeds and young trees, and carried my stuff down a narrow path that led toward the creek. The first thing that hit me was how silent everything was. No sounds of people, no hum of cars in the distance. Even the birds seemed rare. I found a clearing beside the creek where old picnic tables still sat, half collapsed and covered in moss. There were traces of fire pits, rusted cans, and broken bottles scattered around. Felt like time had stopped there. I set up my tent near a fallen log, facing the water, and gathered some dry wood. By late afternoon, the light was already dimming between the trees. I cooked a small meal over the fire and watched the smoke drift into the dark. The creek sounded steady like a soft background hum. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the tree line. It's strange how, when you're alone that far out, even normal sounds feel off. A branch snapping, a leaf falling. It all hits harder. Around 9 p.m., I climbed into my tent. The forest was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness that eats the beam of a flashlight. I lay on my back, listening. The air had that damp chill that settles in your bones. I must have drifted in and out of sleep because I remember waking up to what I thought was footsteps. Slow, steady, moving somewhere near the creek. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I stayed quiet, just listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, replaced by the creek again. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep easily after that. When I woke the next morning, the sun was bright but weak, barely cutting through the mist. I walked around the area just exploring. I found an old wooden structure a few minutes from my tent. It looked like a restroom building, but the roof had caved in, and vines crawled up the sides. There were bits of broken glass everywhere, and the smell of damp wood. Behind it, I found something stranger, a small trail that wasn't on the map. It looked like it had been used a long time ago. Out of curiosity, I followed it. The path wound through thick brush and climbed a small hill. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the top, and when I did, I found what looked like another clearing, but this one had something built in it. A small wooden cabin, or what was left of it. The windows were gone, the door barely hanging by one hinge. Inside, there were 2 rusted bed frames, an old table, and pieces of a metal stove. I noticed marks on the inside of the door, deep scratches, uneven, like someone had dragged something sharp across it again and again. It didn't look like animal damage. It looked deliberate. I stepped outside and circled the cabin. In the back, buried halfway in the ground, was what looked like a small trench, maybe an old storage pit. It smelled faintly sour, like something had been wet and sealed for too long. I didn't stay long there. The place made me uneasy in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like the air was heavier there, as if something about that spot didn't want people around anymore. I went back to camp and decided to stay one more night before heading home. I spent the afternoon fishing near the creek and reading. By sunset, I noticed the woods getting darker faster than before. The temperature dropped sharply. Around 8 p.m., I built another fire, bigger this time, and sat close to it. The woods felt alive that night, but not in a peaceful way. I started hearing sounds again, small ones at first. Twigs breaking, the faint crunch of footsteps that seemed to move and stop, always just beyond where I could see. I pointed my flashlight toward the trees several times, but the beam hit nothing but mist and branches. The forest around me felt like it was waiting. Every time I thought it was over, I'd hear another sound, a rustle, a quiet thud. Once I swore I saw a shape between the trees. Not clear, just the dark outline of something human-sized standing still. When I shined the light in that direction, it was gone. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. The woods play tricks like that, especially when you're alone. But later that night, I woke again inside my tent. The fire had died out. I could hear something moving slowly, close to where I kept my backpack. The sound of dirt shifting, something scraping lightly. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I just listened. After maybe a minute, the noise stopped. I waited longer before finally pulling the zipper just enough to peek out. There was no one there. The moonlight made everything pale and colorless. My backpack was where I left it, but one of the straps was torn loose, like it had been yanked. That's when I decided I wasn't staying another night. As soon as the first light appeared in the morning, I packed everything fast. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. When I went to load the truck, I noticed something else. The driver's side mirror had been cracked clean down the middle. I hadn't hit anything. There were muddy fingerprints on the door handle, human-sized, but smeared. Driving out of there was the longest 2 hours of my life. I didn't look in the mirrors much. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every turn of the dirt road. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over and sat for a while, just breathing. Later, back in town, I looked up Larch Creek Campground online. I found an old forum post from someone who said their uncle used to camp there before it was shut down. He mentioned that after the flood, a man had stayed behind, living out there alone for years in one of the old cabins. No one ever found him after the forest reclaimed the area. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, but I've thought about it a lot since. The sounds, the broken strap, the fingerprints, it all fits too neatly. Someone was still out there. Maybe someone who never left after the place was abandoned. Someone who had been watching from the trees the whole time. It's been years now, but sometimes I still dream about that forest. The heavy silence, the mist, the faint crack of a twig somewhere too close to ignore. Every time I think about camping again, I remember that feeling of being watched, and I lose the urge completely. I don't think I'll ever go back out there. Some places are left behind for a reason. I had decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2017, somewhere deep in the forests of northern Idaho. I was 27 then, old enough to think I knew what I was doing and young enough to believe nothing bad could really happen to me. I'd been hiking and camping on and off for years, but always with friends or family. This trip was supposed to be different. I wanted quiet, no phones, no noise, no people. Just me, my tent, and the woods. I drove out early in the morning, taking old Forest Service roads that barely showed up on my map. The road grew narrower as I went, swallowed by thick pine and spruce trees. After 2 hours of bumping along gravel and dirt, I reached a clearing beside a small lake. The water was still, the kind of stillness that feels almost heavy. There were no other cars, no other signs of people. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. I unpacked my tent, set it near the lake, and gathered wood for a fire. The air smelled like pine sap and wet earth. The ground was soft with layers of needles. I remember feeling calm in a way I hadn't in a long time. I cooked a simple meal on my little stove. Beans and rice, nothing fancy. And as the sun began to drop behind the trees, I sat by the fire and watched the light fade. The world around me grew darker, but not silent. Crickets chirped, something splashed lightly in the lake, and every now and then I could hear a faint crack of branches somewhere far in the woods. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to go to sleep. The air had cooled down, and the night was darker than I'd expected. When I turned off my flashlight, the blackness was almost solid. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and tried to let my thoughts drift, but sleep didn't come easily. I could hear things outside, twigs snapping, small movements. It's normal, I told myself. Animals, probably deer. I rolled over and forced my eyes shut. I must have dozed off for an hour or two because when I opened my eyes again, my phone said it was almost 1 a.m. The forest had gone quieter, and the fire was just a faint glow now. What woke me wasn't a sound. It was the feeling that something was off. The kind of feeling you can't explain but know in your gut. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The wind had stopped. I couldn't hear the crickets anymore. Then I heard it. A faint crunch of footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, the sound of weight pressing down on damp soil. My heart began to pound. I froze completely, not daring to breathe too loudly. The steps came closer. They weren't animal steps, too heavy, too slow. They stopped right near the tent. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard what sounded like someone exhaling. Just one slow breath. I couldn't see anything through the tent wall, only a faint outline from the dim moonlight outside. I didn't move. I just lay there, every muscle in my body tight. After maybe 30 seconds, the steps started again, moving away this time, back toward the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat there, clutching my pocket knife, staring at the faint shape of the tent wall until the first gray light of morning crept in. When I finally got out, I saw footprints in the dirt about 10 feet from the tent. They weren't mine. They were larger boot prints. They came from the tree line, circled halfway around my campsite, then disappeared back the way they came. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter or another camper, but there were no other campsites nearby, none that I'd seen for miles. I walked toward the tree line, following the prints until they became faint. They led in the general direction of the old logging road I'd driven down. Maybe someone had seen my truck and decided to take a look. That was the only explanation that made sense. Still, something about the careful, slow steps bothered me. It wasn't the way you'd walk if you were just passing by. I tried to shake it off. I cooked breakfast, packed up a bit, and decided I'd stay one more night. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone hiking through late at night. Nothing happened during the day. I fished a little, read a book, and by evening, the uneasiness started to fade. But that night, around the same time, close to 1 a.m., I woke up again. The fire was out, the forest quiet. I didn't hear footsteps this time. What I heard instead was a faint metallic clinking sound, like something tapping against metal. It came from the direction of the lake. I sat up, heart racing. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it through the tent window. For a second, I thought I saw movement near the trees, but it was too dark to be sure. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The night air hit me cold and still. I couldn't see much, but then my light caught something. A faint reflection near the ground, maybe 20 yards away. It looked like the glint of a metal object, maybe a can or a piece of gear. I stared for a while, but there was no movement. After a few minutes, I zipped the tent again and sat there, not sleeping, just waiting for the sun. When daylight came, I walked to the spot I'd seen the glint. There was nothing there. No can, no metal, just disturbed soil and boot prints again. This time, there were more of them, some leading right up behind where my tent was. That's when I decided I was done. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I was throwing stuff into the truck, not even caring about folding or cleaning. I just wanted to leave. As I was about to get in, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the side of a tree near my camp, someone had carved a mark into the bark. A small, crude X, cut fresh, the wood underneath still pale. I drove out fast, barely slowing for the rough patches on the road. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away, sitting at a gas station, hands still shaking as I tried to fill the tank. I looked back at my truck bed, at all the gear thrown around, and realized how lucky I probably was. That night, in a cheap motel, I kept thinking about that sound. The slow breathing, the footsteps, that clinking noise. I didn't imagine it. I know I didn't. Whoever that was had been standing right outside my tent, watching, listening, and the worst part was the realization that they hadn't done anything. Yet, they hadn't spoken, hadn't tried to take anything, hadn't shown themselves. They just wanted to remind me that I wasn't alone out there. A week later, I looked up reports from that area. Missing campers, hikers gone off the trail. There were a few over the past decade. Never solved. No suspects. No signs. I didn't read much more after that. I didn't want to know. I've gone camping since then, but never alone. I can still remember the sound of those footsteps, that breath just outside the thin wall of nylon. It's strange how something so simple can stay in your head. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods with friends and the night gets quiet, that same feeling comes back. The air goes still, and I catch myself glancing toward the dark tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, just barely visible between the trunks. I never went back to Idaho, and I never camp alone anymore. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Wyoming, near a place called Pine Hollow Ridge. I was 26 at the time, working construction jobs on and off, and I just wanted a break from the noise of people. I had done some camping before, but never alone for more than a night or two. This time, I planned for 3 nights, just me, my tent, and the quiet of the woods. The drive up there was slow and bumpy. The forest road twisted up through the pines, and by the time I parked near the old trailhead, it was close to sunset. The air was cold enough that every breath left a thin cloud. I hiked about 1.5 miles down a narrow path until I found a small clearing near a shallow creek. It looked perfect, flat ground, trees on all sides, and a decent distance from the main road. I could hear nothing but the soft trickle of water and the wind cutting through dry leaves. By the time I got the tent up, it was dark enough that I had to use my headlamp. I made a small fire using the wood I had gathered along the trail. The warmth felt good. I sat there eating from a can of beans, the smell of smoke in my clothes, and I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed: quiet, no phone service, no people. That first night was calm. The fire burned low until only embers were left. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the creak and the occasional crack of a branch. Forest sounds never bothered me much. I slept easily. The next morning, I woke up around 7. The ground was cold and damp from dew, and my tent had beads of moisture clinging to it. I boiled some water for instant coffee and walked down to the creek to wash my face. The water was freezing. There were small animal tracks by the bank, probably raccoon or fox. Everything smelled like wet pine. After breakfast, I hiked further upstream to see where the creek came from. About 1/2 mile up, I found an old, half-collapsed wooden bridge. It looked like no one had used it in decades. The boards were gray and splintered, and the handrails were long gone. On the other side of it was a faint path heading deeper into the woods, almost hidden under leaves and weeds. I didn't go far down it. Something about it felt off, not dangerous exactly, just forgotten. I went back to camp and spent most of the afternoon gathering wood and trying to fish with the small rod I had brought. I didn't catch anything. By evening, clouds started rolling in. The air grew heavy, and the forest got quiet. Too quiet. I remember noticing how the wind had stopped, like the whole place was holding its breath. That night it rained. Hard. The sound of the rain on the tent was constant, a steady drumbeat that made it hard to sleep. Water pooled around the edges of the tent, and I had to push some of it away with my boots. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the wet leaves, slow and irregular. I froze. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. I kept still, listening. The sound came from behind my tent, near the creek. Then it stopped. For a long time, I lay there, waiting. The rain muffled everything. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe water dripping from a branch. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke in the morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked. I stepped outside and checked around the tent. There were tracks in the mud, human tracks. Not boot prints like mine, but bare feet. They weren't huge, but they were clear enough to know they weren't from an animal. I stared at them for a long time. The prints came from the direction of the creek and stopped about 10 feet from my tent. Then they turned back the same way. I didn't know what to think. Maybe someone was wandering out here, maybe a hiker who got lost. Still, it bothered me. I decided to stay close to camp that day just in case. I gathered more wood, checked my gear, and kept my hatchet close by. All day, the woods felt different, quieter, heavier. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I turned, there was nothing there, just trees and dripping branches. By evening, I had made up my mind to leave early the next morning. I packed up most of my stuff so I could head out quickly. I made a small fire before dark, just enough to stay warm. I sat there watching the smoke twist upward into the dim light, my nerves tight. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. Fabric tearing. It was faint but close, maybe a few feet away. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking in my hand. Right outside my tent, near the fire pit, I saw movement. Someone crouching low, turning fast when the light hit them. I only caught a glimpse. Pale skin, dark, wet hair clinging to their face, clothes torn and filthy. Then they bolted toward the creek. I jumped out, my heart hammering. The rain had started again, light at first but growing harder by the second. I could hear splashing from the creek, then nothing but rain. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake until dawn, listening to every sound, every gust of wind. When light finally came, I packed what was left of my stuff and left most of my gear behind. The tent, the cooler, everything. I just wanted out of there. The trail back to the car felt twice as long as before. My clothes were soaked, boots heavy with mud. When I reached the car, I looked back once. The ridge hidden behind trees, silent again. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station about 40 miles away. I sat in the parking lot, still breathing hard, staring at my muddy hands. Later that day, I called the local ranger station to report what I'd seen. They said they'd send someone out to check the area. A week later, a ranger called me back. He said they found signs of someone camping out illegally in the area, maybe a drifter or squatter. They found makeshift shelters, some old tools, and food wrappers near the creek, maybe half a mile from where I had been. He told me it wasn't the first report like that. People had mentioned strange noises or footprints, things going missing from campsites. He said whoever it was probably didn't mean harm, just living off the grid, surviving. But that didn't make it any less unnerving. I never went back there. Sometimes when it rains at night, I still think about those bare footprints outside my tent. I think about how quiet the woods were that day, how it felt like the forest was watching. Maybe it was just one person, someone lost or broken, living out there in the wet dark. But knowing how close they came, how they circled around me while I slept, that's what stays with me. And the worst part isn't that someone was there, just wondering how long they had been there before I noticed. It was late September 2011 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip out in the northern woods of Oregon. I'd been working too much that summer, barely seeing anything beyond my apartment walls, and I just needed quiet. No phone, no people, no noise. The weather forecast said there might be rain, but I didn't care. I liked the sound of rain in the woods. It made everything feel distant, tucked away from the world. I drove my old Ford Ranger down a narrow dirt road that seemed to have been forgotten years ago. The trees leaned inward, tall pines and dripping ferns pressing against the edges of the trail. I found a clearing about a mile off an old logging route, wide enough for my tent, my truck, and a small fire pit. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in layers of pine needles and old mud hardened from the summer heat. I set up my tent by a line of trees facing a shallow creek, where the water barely moved. By the time I finished, the clouds were already turning darker. The air had that heavy, electric feeling before rain, thick and cool, like it was waiting to break open. I got a small fire going and boiled water for instant noodles, sitting on an old camping stool and staring into the trees. The woods were quiet in that way that isn't peaceful, more like something was holding its breath. It started raining around 9. At first, just a light patter against the tarp, but it quickly turned heavy, loud enough that I couldn't even hear the creek anymore. The fire hissed and died down, leaving only a few glowing pieces of wood. I got inside the tent, zipped it up, and lay on my sleeping bag, listening. The sound of rain on nylon is comforting for a while, but when you're alone and deep in the woods, it starts to feel different. Every sound blends: raindrops, wind, branches, until you can't tell what's moving out there and what's not. I turned off my lantern to save the battery and lay in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. The rain kept pounding, harder now. Water started pooling at the edges of the tent floor. I shifted around to find a dry spot, trying to ignore how cold it was getting. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't the rain, this was heavier, slower, like someone stepping through wet ground. I froze. My first thought was that it could be an animal, maybe a deer or an elk, but then it stopped. The rain drowned everything else, so it was hard to be sure. I stayed still, barely breathing, just listening. Then I heard it again, a slow drag, then a soft squish close to the tent. My chest tightened. I reached for the small hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled partway around the tent. Not quick, not panicked, just steady. Then silence again. The rain kept falling, but the sound of those steps seemed carved into the noise. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I opened my eyes, it was early morning, pale light leaking through the rain clouds. Everything was soaked. My tent was half collapsed from the weight of the water pooling on top. I got out slowly, gripping the hatchet, scanning the trees. There were footprints, faint but visible in the soft mud. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, big ones. They came from the tree line, stopped right behind my tent, then turned back the way they came. I felt sick looking at them. There was no sign of another camp nearby, no car tracks, no signs of people. Whoever it was had walked here, in the middle of a storm, just to stand behind my tent. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe a hiker passing through who saw my camp and didn't want to bother me. But no one hikes in that kind of rain at 2 in the morning, not miles off any real trail. I decided to pack up right then. My hands were shaking the whole time, not from the cold, but from the thought that whoever had come by could still be out there. The forest felt heavier that morning. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and mist rolled low through the trees, twisting between trunks like smoke. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement, just the flicker of something dark between the trees. When I got to the truck, I noticed something else. On the passenger side door, right above the handle, was a muddy handprint. Not smeared, not brushed, a full, deliberate handprint. I stood there staring at it, feeling my stomach drop. The print was huge, larger than mine by a lot, and it was fresh, the kind of wet mud that only could have stuck there during the night. Whoever it was, they'd come right up to my truck while I was asleep. Maybe they were checking if it was unlocked. Maybe they were waiting to see if I'd wake up. I started the engine and pulled out fast, the tires slipping in the wet dirt. The road back out seemed longer than it had the day before. Every curve looked the same, the trees crowding closer, the mud slick and deep. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me. When I finally hit the paved road again, I pulled over near a gas station about 20 miles out and just sat there, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. I didn't even realize how cold I was until the heater started blowing warm air. I went inside, bought coffee, and tried to calm down. My reflection in the window looked pale and tired, like I hadn't slept in days. For a while, I tried to tell myself it was probably some lost hunter or someone curious who'd wandered too close. But that handprint, the way it was placed, the size of it, it didn't feel like an accident. Felt like someone testing something, testing how close they could get. When I got home, I washed the truck, but the mud in the handprint had left a faint outline even after scrubbing. I can still see it when the sun hits the door a certain way, a reminder of that night. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still love the woods, But there's something different now when I think about being out there. I think about how easy it is for someone to find you when you think you're hidden, how small a tent really is between you and whatever walks through those trees in the dark. Sometimes, late at night when it rains, I still hear it in my head, that slow, heavy sound of footsteps circling outside. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. They were close enough to touch the door, close enough to listen, and for whatever reason, they decided to leave. That's what haunts me the most. Not what happened that night, but the thought of what could have. I was 28 when I decided to camp alone in northern Arkansas. It was late October 2019. The weather was cool, the trees had turned shades of orange and rust, and the air carried that heavy damp smell that always comes after rain. I had taken a week off work, hoping to get away from people for a bit. Just me, a tent, a fishing rod, and quiet. I parked my truck near a small forest access road off Highway 7, near the Buffalo River. The ground was muddy but firm enough to drive through. I followed the dirt track for about half a mile until it opened up into a clearing near the riverbank. There was no one around, just water slowly moving, leaves falling, and the occasional crack of a twig in the woods. I set up my tent close to the trees, facing the river. I liked being near the sound of water at night. It helped me sleep. I unpacked my cooler, lit a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun went down, the forest started to change. Everything got quieter, heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. You never realize how loud silence can get until you're alone miles from anyone else. That first night went fine. I stayed up late watching the fire die down. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I heard small things moving outside. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Normal sounds, I told myself. Probably raccoons or deer. I didn't even bother to check. I slept light but unbothered. The next morning, I woke early. The fog hung thick over the river. I fished for a couple of hours, caught nothing, but didn't mind. The weather warmed up by midday. I hiked along the riverbank, maybe 2 miles downstream, where the land dipped into a shallow valley. There, I found another old fire pit. Rocks arranged in a circle, blackened from past use. Someone had camped there recently. There were even a few empty cans of beer and a torn flannel shirt hanging from a branch. That gave me a weird feeling. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived, but the ashes looked fresh, maybe a day old. I didn't think too hard about it, though. I figured other campers had probably packed up that morning. Still, when I went back to my camp later, I couldn't help scanning the trees a bit more than before. That night, the wind picked up. Around 10 p.m., I was sitting near the fire when I heard movement again. Heavier this time, not like small animals. It sounded like footsteps on wet leaves, just a few yards past the tree line behind my tent. I froze, staring into the dark. Nothing, just blackness between the trees. I waited maybe a minute, then went back to the fire. But the sound came again. Slower, crunching in intervals, almost like someone trying not to make noise. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. The light reflected off something for just a split second. I thought it was eyes, but the height was wrong. It was too low for a person, too high for an animal. It looked like the faint shine of a metal object. Then it was gone. I felt my chest tighten. I killed the light, sat still, and listened. Nothing moved for several minutes. Then I heard a soft splash from the direction of the river. That made me move. I grabbed my flashlight again, turned it on, and aimed toward the water. Nothing there either. Just ripples spreading across the dark surface. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon again. The forest plays tricks on you when you're alone. I forced myself to calm down, threw more wood on the fire, and stayed awake until almost 2 a.m. before finally lying down. The next morning, I walked around my camp just to reassure myself. I found boot prints near the back of my tent. Not mine. They were larger, wider, and fresher than any I'd left. The mud was still slightly soft, like they'd been made overnight. They led away toward the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I told myself someone might have wandered close by, maybe a hiker passing through, but deep down it didn't feel right. The prints were too close to where I'd been sleeping. I packed my gear into the truck around noon, planning to head back to town, but I stopped halfway. I'd driven 4 hours to get there, and it felt stupid to leave because of some footprints. So I unpacked again, though I moved my tent closer to the truck this time. That afternoon, I sat by the river trying to fish again. Couldn't relax. Every time a branch snapped somewhere behind me, I turned around. I didn't see anything, not even a bird, but I kept having the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That evening, the weather turned colder. I built a big fire and ate a can of beans for dinner. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a faint light through the trees across the river, like a small flashlight moving between trunks. It wasn't steady. It would flash, disappear, then appear again a few feet away. I stared at it for maybe a full minute. It didn't make sense. There weren't any trails on that side, and it would have been hard to get over there without a boat. Then the light went out completely. I stayed by the fire a long time watching that direction. Around midnight, the woods went silent again. No crickets, no rustling, just dead quiet. I couldn't stand it anymore. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and sat there. I left the fire burning outside. I must have drifted off sometime after 2 a.m., sitting upright in the driver's seat. I woke up around 4 a.m. The fire had burned out. There was fog again, thick as smoke. When I opened my door, I smelled something strong, like wet iron, almost metallic. It was coming from the river. I turned on my flashlight and walked slowly toward the bank. There was a small dead fish lying on the shore, and beside it, something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, red plaid, like the same pattern I'd seen hanging from the tree near that old fire pit downstream. My stomach turned. I looked around, no footprints this time, just wet leaves. But I noticed something else. Small, broken twigs leading away from the water, heading deeper into the woods behind my tent. They were spaced too evenly to be random. I followed them about 20 feet in, then stopped. The beam of my flashlight caught something ahead, an old tarp half buried under leaves. It looked like someone had used it as a ground cover. Nearby were crushed cans and a pile of bones, small ones, maybe from animals, maybe not. I didn't get close enough to tell. I backed away slowly, every step careful not to make noise. When I got back to my truck, I didn't even fold the tent. I threw everything I could grab into the bed and started the engine. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the trees. For just a second, I saw a figure standing far back in the woods, tall, still, wearing what looked like a dark hood or jacket. He wasn't moving. He was just there, facing my direction. I didn't stop. I drove straight through the mud, up the access road, back onto the highway, and didn't look back. When I got home the next morning, I reported it to the local sheriff's office. They sent someone out there later that week. I called to follow up. They said they found my abandoned tent and tire tracks, but no sign of any person. No tarp, no bones, nothing. They told me it might have been an old poacher's site or maybe leftover junk from hunters. They didn't seem too worried about it. I tried to accept that answer, but it never sat right with me. I still remember the smell by the river and those prints near my tent. I've gone camping plenty of times since then, but never alone, and never near that part of Arkansas again. Sometimes, late at night, when I hear something outside my house, just the creak of the porch or the wind in the trees, I catch myself freezing, holding my breath, listening the same way I did that night by the river. And every time, I still see that shape in the woods, standing perfectly still, waiting for me to notice it. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to camp alone for the first time. I was 23, just out of college, and wanted to get away from the noise of the city for a while. My uncle owned an old piece of farmland in southern Nebraska that hadn't been used in years. He said I could stay there if I wanted, that the fields were empty and the barn was still standing. I liked the idea of open space and quiet nights, so I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, and drove out there on a Friday afternoon. The road to the farm was rough and narrow, surrounded by tall, dry grass that brushed against my truck. The last few miles were just dirt and gravel, and by the time I reached the gate, my tires and windows were covered in dust. The place looked almost forgotten. The wooden fence was rotting, some boards missing. The farmhouse itself stood far back, leaning slightly like time had pulled it down halfway. The barn was still there, though faded red, with patches of metal nailed over broken boards. I parked near the barn, turned off the engine, and for a while just listened. There wasn't any sound besides the low wind moving through the grass and the faint creak of metal from the barn roof. I could smell the dry dirt and the faint odor of old hay coming from inside. I set up my tent in a flat area beside the barn. The sun was still high but starting to soften, and the shadows stretched long across the field. I remember feeling calm then, alone but in a peaceful way. I walked around a bit to look at the place. The field stretched far into the distance, ending in a line of trees that bordered the property. There were no animals, no fresh tracks, just the marks of an old plow line that had faded over the years. When the sun began to set, I built a small fire using some leftover wood and dry sticks from inside the barn. I cooked a can of beans and sat by the fire as the light faded. The air grew cooler, and crickets started chirping in the grass. The horizon glowed orange and pink, and for a moment, I thought it was one of the most peaceful sights I had ever seen. When it got completely dark, the quiet became heavier. I had camped in forests before, but this was different. Out here, it wasn't the sound of rustling trees or running water. It was pure emptiness. Every small sound stood out. The crunch of my boots, the crack of the firewood, the wind brushing against the tent. I felt fine at first, but as the night deepened, something about the silence started to feel uncomfortable. Sometime around 10, I decided to take one last look around before going to sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and walked a few steps away from the tent. The barn looked different in the dark. Its doors hung open, and the black inside seemed to swallow the light when I shined the beam toward it. I thought about closing the doors but left them. I didn't want to hear them creak all night if the wind picked up. Back in my tent, I zipped myself in and lay on my back listening to the faint sound of wind through the grass. I was half asleep when I heard something. It was a small, sharp sound, like metal scraping lightly against wood. It came from outside the tent, near the barn. I stayed still for a while, telling myself it was just the wind shifting some old tools. Then it came again, a short, dragging sound, then silence. I turned on my flashlight and listened harder. My heartbeat started to feel heavy in my chest. There it was again, metal against wood, a bit louder this time, like something being dragged slowly. I sat up, unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The night was still, and my fire had burned down to faint orange coals. The barn stood quiet, the doors open wider now. I thought maybe they were just swinging in the wind, so I got out and walked toward it, keeping my flashlight low. The air smelled stronger near the barn. Old hay and something else, something sour like rotting grain. I shined my light through the doorway. Inside were a few old tools, piles of hay, and a rusted wheelbarrow tipped on its side. Nothing unusual, but as I moved the light across the floor, I saw fresh marks, drag lines in the dirt that hadn't been there earlier. They led from the far corner of the barn toward the open door. I followed the marks slowly, and when I reached the corner, I saw an old feed sack lying there, ripped open. Next to it was a pile of bones. Animal bones, I thought at first, but they were arranged oddly, stacked in a small heap like someone had been sorting through them. Some were cracked open. I felt uneasy and backed out of the barn. The night air felt colder when I stepped outside. I turned back to my tent, trying not to think about it, telling myself maybe coyotes had dragged something in. I sat by the dying fire for a while, adding a few sticks just to have some light. I didn't go back inside the tent for nearly an hour. When I finally lay down, it took me a long time to fall asleep. I woke again sometime after midnight. The fire was dead, and everything was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything, not even the outline of my hand. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound, but closer this time. It wasn't metal now, it sounded like fabric sliding against dirt. Stopped, then started again, slower, steady. I froze completely. I didn't move, didn't breathe for a few seconds. Came from right outside the tent. Then silence. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it. After a minute, I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could, barely an inch. The cold air hit my face, and I looked out with my flashlight ready. I turned it on and swept the beam across the ground. Something was lying a few feet away. At first, I thought it was a bundle of clothes, but when I stepped out and pointed the light directly at it, I realized it was a jacket, an old, muddy one, folded and set neatly in the dirt. Next to it were boots. Both were caked with dried mud. I hadn't seen them before. I turned the light toward the barn again, and this time I saw movement. Someone was inside, just the faintest shift of a shadow against the doorway. I didn't wait to look closer. I grabbed my keys and ran straight to the truck. My heart felt like it would burst. When I turned the ignition, the headlights lit up the barn fully. For a split second, I saw someone, tall, thin, standing halfway in the doorway, facing my direction. The moment the light hit them, they stepped backward into the dark. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the dirt road, not caring about the bumps or the dust cloud behind me. I drove until I hit the main road, then didn't stop until I reached a small gas station 20 miles away. I parked there and waited for the sky to turn gray with morning before I finally called my uncle. I told him there was someone on the property. He said the nearest neighbor was miles away and no one had lived there for years. A few days later, he called me back after checking the place. He said the barn door was shut tight, the fire pit still had ashes, and my tent was gone. He didn't find any clothes or boots, and the feed sack in the barn was gone too. He thought I imagined it, maybe got spooked by animals. But I know what I saw. I know there was someone there that night. I never went back. Sometimes, I still think about those marks on the barn floor and that folded jacket, and how quiet it was out there. So quiet that even the smallest movement felt loud enough to fill the night. I think someone had been living there for a long time, maybe hiding in that barn, waiting for food or supplies. Maybe they were used to the silence until I showed up and disturbed it. That thought is what still keeps me awake sometimes. Not knowing how long they were there before I noticed. Not knowing if they were watching me from the start. I went camping alone once in northern Montana, late September of 2018. I was 29 then, working a quiet desk job and feeling like I needed a break from screens and people. I had done small solo hikes before, but never a full weekend of camping alone. I told a coworker I was heading out, packed my gear, and drove north toward the mountains where the tree lines grew thick and the air turned colder by the mile. The plan was simple. Hike along the small creek near Pine Hollow, camp somewhere off-trail, fish a little, maybe take some photos and just be still for a few days. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear for a bit. I parked my truck on a dirt pull-off, locked it, and followed the faint path down toward the creek that cut through the valley. The forest there was heavy with pine, the kind that keeps most sunlight away. It always felt like late evening, even when it was noon. By the time I set up camp, it was already late afternoon. The air was crisp, and the wind barely moved. My tent sat beside a fallen tree, facing the water. I made a small fire with dry branches and boiled some water for instant coffee. I remember how still everything was. No birds, no insects, no sound of another person anywhere. The only noise was the water sliding over the rocks of the creek. I ate some jerky and bread, checked my phone for signal, none, and that was fine. I wanted to disconnect. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I added more wood to the fire and sat there for a long time, staring into it. The flames flickered orange across the tree trunks, and behind them, the darkness thickened. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, it was cold enough that I could see my breath even inside the tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sharp sound. It wasn't close, but it was clear, like a branch breaking under weight, not from the wind. I lay still, listening. Then there was another one, farther up the slope behind me. I thought maybe it was a deer. That was common enough. But after a few minutes, there were more, not steady, not rhythmic, just spaced out, slow steps. I felt a pressure in my chest, the kind that comes when you try to convince yourself something is normal but your body knows better. I told myself to ignore it. I pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin and closed my eyes. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again because when I opened them, it was morning. The first thing I noticed was that my fire pit was disturbed. Not kicked apart, just disturbed. Some ashes were scattered, and a few of the larger pieces of wood were pushed out of the circle I'd made with rocks. It looked like someone had poked through it with a stick. I checked around the tent, saw no prints clear enough to be sure of anything, and tried to shrug it off. Maybe an animal had been nosing around. I went down to the creek, washed my face with the freezing water, and tried to shake the feeling that someone had been there. I told myself not to let my imagination ruin the trip. After breakfast, I grabbed my small pack and followed the creek downstream, fishing along the way. Around noon, I found an old piece of rusted wire fencing tangled in the brush. It looked like it had been there for decades. The posts were mostly gone, just bits of metal half buried in dirt. Not unusual in these forests. There were old cattle properties around here a long time ago. I walked past it, kept following the creek, and found a nice deep pool beneath a set of rocks. I caught 2 small trout, cleaned them, and decided to head back before it got dark again. When I reached my camp, I froze. My tent was zipped open. At first I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close it when I left that morning, but I knew I always did, to keep bugs out. The flap was pulled wide open. My sleeping bag was half dragged out of the tent, lying in the dirt. My small folding knife that I kept beside it was gone. My backpack was unzipped too, and everything inside was tossed around. Nothing seemed stolen except maybe that knife. My wallet was still in my jacket pocket, my phone still dead in the side pouch. There was no sound around me, just the quiet wind and water. My heart started to pound. I kept scanning the trees, trying to spot movement, but nothing stirred. I waited there, still as I could, for what felt like an hour but was probably just a few minutes. Took me a while to think straight. Eventually, I grabbed my things and repacked them as fast as I could. I decided to hike back to my truck, even though it was still a few miles away. I didn't want to stay another night out there. As I slung my pack over my shoulder, I noticed something strange near the fallen tree. A single, fresh footprint in the mud. It wasn't from my boot. It was bigger and the tread looked different, wider spacing, maybe a work boot or a hiking shoe. I crouched and stared at it for a long time. Whoever it was, they had been right next to my tent. I didn't waste any more time. I followed the creek back toward the way I came, keeping my pace steady but quick. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the water and my own heartbeat. I could feel eyes on me even when there was nothing there. As I got closer to the place where the creek curved up toward the main trail, I saw something that stopped me again. Across the water, maybe 30 yards away, there was an old tarp hanging between two trees. It was faded green, ripped in a few places, like it had been there for months. Beneath it were shapes, maybe bags, maybe buckets. It was someone's camp. It looked abandoned, but I couldn't be sure. I stood there for a long time, trying to decide whether to cross and check it out. Then I noticed something else. A small pile of burned cans and bones near the tarp. It looked recent. I didn't go any closer. I turned and kept walking, faster now, following the water until I reached the dirt road. When I finally saw my truck, a wave of relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I threw my pack in the back seat, got in, and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, watching the tree line. Nothing moved. I started the engine and drove out of there without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. When I went to the bathroom to wash my face, I noticed small scratches on my wrist and dirt on my neck. I must have brushed against something in the rush to leave. I remember staring at myself in the mirror, feeling both stupid and lucky. That night, in a cheap motel, I laid awake thinking about it. Someone had been watching me. Maybe a hunter, maybe a squatter, maybe someone who just didn't want me near their camp. I kept replaying the sounds from that first night. Those slow steps up the slope, the scattered ashes, the missing knife. I realized how easily it could have gone worse. The next morning, I reported what happened to a local ranger station. The man behind the desk took notes but didn't seem surprised. He said there were often off-grid types living out in those woods, especially as the weather started to turn. Some didn't like visitors. He said they'd send someone to check around Pine Hollow, but I could tell from his tone that it wasn't the first time he'd heard a story like that. I never found out who it was or if they ever went back to that spot. I haven't gone camping alone since. Sometimes, when I drive through rural areas and see a trail disappearing into the trees, I still think about that single footprint by my tent. How quiet it had been, how close that person stood to me while I slept. And every time I think about camping again, I remember that silence, that cold stillness of the forest when something is out there, just watching. It was late October 2014, somewhere deep in the woods of northern Arkansas. The rain had started earlier that afternoon, a slow drizzle that turned into a steady sheet by the time I finished setting up camp. I was 26 then, working as a delivery driver during the week and trying to spend my weekends away from the noise of the city. I liked being alone in the woods. No people, no traffic, just trees, wet dirt, and the sound of nature. I had parked my old pickup off a narrow dirt road and hiked about a mile down a muddy trail to a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat patch of earth I'd found a few months earlier while hiking. I liked it because it was quiet and hidden, with a small creek running nearby that made a soft gurgling sound at night. By the time I got my tent up, my jacket and jeans were already soaked. The ground had turned into a soft mess of mud, and every step made that thick sucking noise when I moved around. I boiled some water on my small camping stove and ate instant noodles, sitting on a folding chair under the thin tarp I tied between two trees. The rain didn't stop. It just kept falling harder, tapping on the tarp and my tent like endless fingers. As the sky got darker, I noticed how quiet the forest became. Normally, even at night, you can hear frogs or crickets or something, but the rain seemed to have drowned everything out. The only sound left was the rain hitting leaves, the occasional wind blowing through branches, and the creek in the distance. After eating, I cleaned up, stuffed everything in my backpack, and zipped myself inside the tent. It was a small two-person tent, just enough for me, my sleeping bag, and a few supplies. The inside smelled like wet nylon and dirt. I took off my soaked jacket, hung it by the entrance, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The rain on the tent was almost calming, but there was this strange heaviness in the air. I tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't. Maybe it was the cold or the fact that the rain wasn't letting up. My tent would light up every few seconds from flashes of lightning, followed by deep rumbles that rolled across the forest. Each time it happened, I'd catch quick glimpses of the wet trees outside through the thin tent walls. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a different sound. It wasn't thunder or rain. It was more like a sharp snap, like a branch breaking. I opened my eyes and stayed still, listening. The rain had softened to a light drizzle now, but the forest was still mostly quiet. I could hear the creek faintly, and then another sound, this one slower, duller. It reminded me of footsteps, but they were uneven. Wet shoes maybe squishing through mud. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a boar. But the sound was too steady, too heavy. I could hear each step pressing into the wet ground, one after another, stopping and starting again. The footsteps were getting closer to the clearing. I stayed completely still. My tent was zipped shut, and my flashlight was next to my sleeping bag. I didn't dare turn it on. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the pulse in my throat. The footsteps stopped for a long moment, maybe 20 feet away. Then, I heard another sound, metal clinking softly, like something hitting against a belt buckle. The rain made everything harder to judge. I couldn't tell how close whoever it was stood, but I knew they weren't far. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. The kind of silence that comes before something bad happens. It hung thick in the air. Then, the footsteps started again, slower now, circling. I could hear them moving around the clearing, crunching through leaves and wet soil. Whoever it was didn't say a word. I felt every muscle in my body lock up. When they got closer to my tent, I could hear the mud squishing right outside. I saw the faint shadow of legs through the fabric when lightning flashed in the sky. They stood there, not moving, just outside my tent. The rain had almost stopped completely. After a few seconds, I heard that soft metallic sound again. Something brushing against the tent wall, maybe a knife or a tool. My breath caught. I slowly reached for the small hatchet I always kept near my sleeping bag, gripping it tight but not moving an inch. The shadow outside stayed there for what felt like forever. I could hear breathing now, faint but clear, slow and deep. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned and started walking away. The steps faded into the distance, swallowed by the rain picking up again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up, back pressed against the tent wall, holding the hatchet until my fingers went numb. Every rustle or gust of wind made my heart jump. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, I saw the first hints of daylight through the fabric, a dull gray light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked outside. Everything was soaked. Puddles had formed in the clearing, and the trees were dripping water from every branch. I didn't see anyone, but when I stepped out, I saw footprints in the mud. Large ones, definitely from boots. They circled my tent, just like I'd heard, and led off toward the trees on the other side of the clearing. I followed them for maybe 10 yards before they disappeared into the thicker brush, washed away by the rain. Near the edge of my camp, I found something half buried in the mud. A small piece of metal, like part of a buckle or tool clip. It was rusty and bent. I didn't recognize it. That was enough for me. I packed up as fast as I could, barely caring that everything was still wet. My hands were shaking, but I kept moving. I hiked back to my truck, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The trail felt different now, more closed in, like the trees were watching. When I finally reached the truck, the relief I felt was like nothing else. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and drove out of there fast, the tires sliding through the mud. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away from that forest. I sat there for a while, just staring through the windshield, rain sliding down the glass. My clothes were still damp, and my hands smelled like wet metal. For a few days after, I tried to convince myself it was just a hunter passing by, maybe someone lost or checking traps. But the more I thought about it, the less that made sense. No hunter would walk around someone's camp in the middle of a storm without saying a word. No one would just stand there, breathing, circling a tent. I never went back to that spot again. In fact, I stopped camping alone after that. I still love the woods, but every time it rains and I hear that slow, steady tapping on the roof, I remember that night. The sound of footsteps in the mud, the quiet breathing just outside thin nylon walls, and the way the forest held its breath while something or someone stood there watching. And the worst part isn't what I saw or didn't see. It's the thought that maybe they were just waiting for me to move, to unzip the tent, to make a sound, waiting to see if I was awake. It was early September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through southern France. I had been traveling across Europe for a couple of months, mostly staying in hostels and cheap motels, and I wanted a few quiet days alone in nature. I picked a spot near a small village called Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. It was surrounded by hills and thick forests that looked untouched, the kind of place where you could hike all day without seeing another person. The campsite I chose was simple, just a flat clearing near a narrow dirt road, a few hundred meters from a small river. The sound of the water flowing was steady and peaceful, and there was a faint smell of pine in the air. I parked my small rented car on the side of the road and spent most of the first day setting up my tent, building a small fire pit, and exploring the area. The weather was perfect, warm during the day and cool at night. I remember sitting by the fire that evening, feeling completely relaxed, listening to the faint sound of crickets and the occasional splash of something in the river. That first night was calm. I slept well, but things started to feel strange the next morning. When I woke up, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of my camp, maybe 10 or 12 feet away from my tent. They were clearly from boots, not from an animal, and they didn't look like mine. They led out from the woods and then disappeared back the same way. I tried to tell myself it could have been a hiker passing by during the night, though it didn't make much sense. The road nearby wasn't used often, and I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. I brushed it off and went about my day. I spent the morning fishing by the river, then went on a long hike through the forest. The area was beautiful, but it also had that kind of silence that makes you overly aware of your own breathing. I came across an old, collapsed stone structure in the woods, maybe a farmhouse or storage shed from decades ago. There were rusty tools scattered around, all half buried in the dirt. I didn't stay long because the place gave me a strange feeling, like I was intruding somewhere I shouldn't be. When I got back to my campsite later that afternoon, I noticed something that froze me for a few seconds. My folding chair, which I had left near the fire pit, was turned around, facing the woods instead of the river. I was certain I hadn't left it that way. It was such a small detail, but it made me feel watched. I looked around the trees for a long time, scanning for movement or sound, but the forest was quiet. I told myself it was probably the wind, or maybe I just remembered wrong. Still, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling for the rest of the day. As evening came, I made myself dinner and sat by the fire again. The forest grew darker faster than usual, the trees swallowing the light as the sun dropped. I tried reading a book with my flashlight, but I couldn't focus. Every time I thought I heard something, a branch snap, leaves moving, I would turn my head too quickly, trying to catch sight of something, but there was never anything there. Around midnight, I finally decided to go into my tent. The night air was cool, and I zipped the tent closed tightly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like slow crunching footsteps on dirt. I didn't move at first. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps came from the direction of the trees, slow and careful, like someone trying not to make noise. They stopped near my car. I could hear a faint metallic sound, maybe the door handle being touched or tested. My throat felt dry. I didn't move or even breathe loudly. After a few seconds, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I lay there completely still, waiting for what felt like forever. Then I heard the sound again, this time closer, near my tent, the soft crunch of boots on dirt. Then nothing, just silence. I stayed awake until dawn, barely moving, clutching the small knife I had brought for cooking. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. Everything looked normal at first glance, but when I checked the car, there were smudges on the door handle, like someone had touched it with dirty fingers. The footprints were back too, clearer this time, circling the campsite once before heading into the woods. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear as fast as I could, throwing things into the trunk without caring how messy it was. Before leaving, I took one last look at the tree line. It was still quiet, nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been there all night watching me. I drove back toward the main road, the narrow dirt path twisting through the trees. After maybe 15 minutes, I saw something ahead, a small wooden sign that I hadn't noticed before when I first came in. It was old and half covered in moss, written in French. I stopped the car to read it, brushing away some of the dirt. It said something along the lines of private land, do not enter. Below that, carved faintly into the wood, was another line that looked newer, carved by hand. Camping interdit après 1998. Camping forbidden after 1998. I felt a cold rush through my chest. Why would camping be forbidden there? I didn't know if it was because of accidents, wildlife, or something else, but I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. I kept driving until I reached the nearest small town. I stopped at a gas station to grab a coffee and calm myself down. While I was standing outside, I noticed a man sitting on a bench near the station. He looked dirty, wearing an old green jacket, his face rough and unshaven. He was staring directly at me. It wasn't a casual look. It was focused, like he recognized me. For a moment, I thought maybe I was just paranoid after the night I'd had. But then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like a small grin that didn't reach his eyes, and pointed at my car. I turned to look at it, and when I turned back, he was gone. Just like that. I didn't even bother finishing my coffee. I got back into the car and drove straight north, not stopping until I was several hours away. That night, I stayed in a cheap hotel in Lyon. I checked the locks twice, closed the curtains, and left the TV on for background noise. I tried to convince myself it was all just a string of coincidences. Maybe a local wandering through the woods, maybe someone curious about my car. But every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that man sitting on the bench, staring at me like he'd been expecting me. A few days later, I looked up the name of the area where I had camped. It turned out that there had been a missing person case there years ago, a hiker who was last seen camping in that same forest. The report said they never found him or his gear, just his car abandoned near the road. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make me certain I'd made the right choice leaving when I did. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, when I think back to that night, I can still remember the sound of those slow footsteps moving through the dirt, stopping right outside my tent, and that feeling that someone was just standing there in the dark, watching me breathe. It was late October 2018 when I decided to go camping alone in the northern part of Montana, near a small lake called Turner's Pond. I had driven there in my old 2002 Jeep Liberty, packed with a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with food, and just enough gear to last me 2 nights. I wanted quiet. No people, no phone signal, no traffic noise. Just me, the sound of water, and the cold air that came with the changing season. The road leading to the camping spot was rough and narrow, more like a forgotten trail than a road. Trees stood on both sides, their branches bending over like they wanted to close me in. By the time I reached the clearing near the lake, the sky was already turning gray. I remember how the wind had a bite to it, and how it smelled like rain mixed with wet soil and pine. I parked the Jeep a few feet from the water and set up my tent on a flat patch of ground. I didn't see anyone else around. The lake was still, almost glassy, reflecting the dull color of the clouds above. Everything was quiet except for the sound of the wind pushing through the trees. There was something peaceful about it, but it also felt heavy, like the kind of silence that watches you back. As the light faded, I gathered some dry branches and started a small fire. I cooked a can of beans and some sausages, ate slowly, and tried to settle in. I remember thinking how different it felt being out there alone. Not scary exactly, just very real. Every sound stood out. The crack of the firewood, the faint ripples of the lake, the occasional snap from the forest. When it started raining, it came down hard and quick. I climbed into the tent, zipped it up, and lay there listening to the steady drumming on the thin fabric. The rain grew heavier through the night, and I could hear water running down the side of the tent. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that wasn't rain. It was dull and rhythmic, like footsteps pressing into wet ground. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps were slow and spaced out, too heavy to be small. They stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath and listened. The sound of rain filled the silence again. Then there was the faintest scrape, like something brushing against the side of the tent. I lay frozen. My flashlight was next to my sleeping bag, but I didn't dare reach for it. The sound came again, softer this time, as if someone was dragging their hand across the fabric. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Then the steps moved away, slow and deliberate, fading into the rain and the darkness. I didn't sleep much after that. Every few minutes I would hear something. Branches cracking, faint splashes near the water, the sound of rain shifting direction. It felt like the whole forest was awake, moving just beyond my sight. By morning, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean but cold, and the ground was muddy. I stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking into the wet soil. There were footprints, deep, human-sized ones, leading from the trees to the side of my tent and then away toward the lake. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, heavier. My stomach tightened. The ground around the lake was soft, so the prints were clear, and they stopped right near the water's edge. I stood there staring at them for a long time, waiting for some logical reason. Maybe a fisherman had passed through during the night. Maybe someone was camping nearby, but I hadn't seen another car, another tent, or even a hint of anyone else since I got there. I tried to brush it off. I made coffee on the small stove I'd brought, packed a few things, and told myself I'd only stay one more night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement. That afternoon, I went for a short hike around the lake, mostly to distract myself. The trail was narrow and muddy, winding between thick trees. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I found an old hunting stand nailed into a tree, half rotted, and a few beer cans rusting near the base. Nothing recent, though. The woods felt untouched, forgotten. When I got back to camp, the sun was low and orange over the water. My fire pit was cold, and the pile of wood I'd left beside it was scattered. I stared at it, trying to remember if maybe I had kicked it by accident before leaving. But no, it was spread out like someone had rummaged through it. That night, the wind picked up again. I sat by the fire, the flames bending and flickering in the gusts. The sound of the forest around me seemed louder. The creaking trees, the constant rustle of branches. I finished my dinner early and went inside the tent before the rain started again. The storm came harder this time. The tent shook, the wind howled, and the rain hit like gravel. I couldn't hear anything else at first, but then there it was again. Footsteps. They came slowly, just like the night before. One step, then another. The sound of wet boots sinking into mud. They stopped close, too close. Then I heard the faint splash of water, as if whoever it was had stepped into the edge of the lake. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but I couldn't move. The rain muffled everything, but I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. I stayed like that, eyes open, waiting for hours. The sound eventually stopped, or maybe the rain drowned it out. I didn't sleep until the sky started to lighten. When I finally stepped out, the rain had turned into a fine mist. The air was heavy with fog, and I could barely see the other side of the lake. That's when I noticed something new. Near the spot where the footprints had been, there was a single boot print. Deep, fresh, facing toward my tent. That was enough. I didn't even pack properly. I threw everything into the Jeep, tore down the tent without folding it, and drove off. The road out was slick and narrow, the trees looking darker than before. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station almost an hour away. My hands were shaking when I filled up the tank. Inside the small shop, the man behind the counter looked at my muddy boots and clothes. He asked if I'd been up by Turner's Pond. I nodded, still trying to steady my breathing. He just said that nobody goes up there much anymore. Not since the old cabin burned down about 5 years ago. I asked what cabin, but he just shrugged and said some guy used to live up there alone, right near the lake, until he disappeared one winter. They never found him. I didn't ask anything else. I bought coffee, sat in the Jeep, and stared out the window for a long time. The fog was thick even there, curling around the trees like smoke. I never went back. Sometimes, when it rains hard at night, I still hear it. The sound of slow, wet footsteps outside the thin wall of my tent, stopping just close enough to let me know I wasn't really alone out there. And the worst part is, I don't think whoever it was came for me by accident. I think they'd been waiting for anyone to show up. It was the fall of 2013 when I decided to go on a solo hunting trip in northern Montana. I was 29 at the time, and I had hunted most of my life, usually with friends or my brother, but that year everyone seemed too busy. I had a week off from work, and the thought of spending it doing nothing felt like a waste. I packed my truck with my old Remington rifle, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with some food, and a box of supplies. I planned to camp deep in the woods near Glacier National Park, far enough that I wouldn't see another soul. The first day went fine. I drove for about 6 hours, passed through a few small towns, and finally turned off onto a dirt road that stretched for miles. The air was cold and thin, the kind that burns your nose when you breathe. The trees looked endless, dark green and tall, with patches of yellow where the leaves had started to die. I parked near a clearing beside a small creek and decided to set up camp there. It was peaceful, no sounds except the water and the wind. After pitching the tent and getting everything in place, I gathered some wood and made a small fire. The temperature dropped fast as the sun went down, and the smell of pine and smoke mixed in the air. I ate a sandwich, drank a beer, and listened to the woods. There was something about the silence that made every tiny sound feel louder. A branch snapping, the creek trickling, the wind brushing through the grass. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The ground was damp, and my breath made small clouds in the air. I grabbed my rifle and a small pack and walked into the woods, following some deer tracks I had noticed the night before. The forest felt different in the early morning, quieter, heavier somehow. The sound of my boots crunching leaves felt too loud. I followed the tracks for about 2 hours, moving slowly, but they eventually disappeared near a rocky slope. I sat down, had some water, and decided to circle back toward camp. On the way back, I noticed something strange. There was an old, faded tent tucked between 2 trees about 100 yards off the path. The fabric was torn, and it looked like it had been there for years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked over. Inside, there wasn't much. A rusted can, a broken flashlight, and what looked like part of a sleeping bag half buried in dirt. No sign of anyone or anything else. I figured it was just an abandoned camp from some old hunter. When I got back to my own camp, the sun was already low. I started another fire, cooked some canned beans, and sat by the flames, cleaning my rifle. That's when I started to notice little things. I thought I saw movement in the tree line across the creek. Quick, like someone ducking behind a tree. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. Later, I heard what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches of leaves not too far off. I held my breath and listened, but after a minute it stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I barely slept that night. The next morning, I went out again. This time, I walked further north into thicker woods. It was colder that day, and a thin fog hung low between the trees. I didn't see much game, just the occasional squirrel or bird. Around noon, I noticed something odd again, boot prints. At first, I thought they might have been mine from the previous day, but the direction was wrong, and they looked fresher. Someone else had been walking around out there. I followed them for a while, half curious, half uneasy. They led deeper into the forest and eventually stopped near a fallen log. The area around it was disturbed, like someone had been sitting there or digging. I didn't find anything except a few scraps of torn fabric and an old cigarette, but it felt wrong, though, like I had just walked into someone's spot. I turned around and headed straight back to camp. When I got there, my stomach dropped. My cooler was open. I knew I'd closed it before leaving. Half the food was gone, the jerky, a few cans, even one of my water bottles. My tent flap was unzipped too. I checked inside, but nothing else seemed missing. It felt off, like someone had been there and wanted me to know. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept the fire going higher than usual, the light spilling into the trees. Every few minutes, I looked around, scanning the dark. The forest felt alive in a bad way, like it was watching me. At one point, I heard something splash in the creek, then a faint rustle. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing, just the reflection of the water. I barely slept again. Every crack or shift in the wind made my heart race. By the time dawn came, I decided I'd had enough. I packed most of my stuff, loaded the truck, and planned to leave after breakfast. But when I went to grab my rifle, it wasn't there. I searched the ground, inside the tent, behind the logs, gone. The rifle was gone. That's when it really hit me. Someone had been watching me. Someone close enough to steal from me while I was there. I felt exposed and stupid for being out there alone. I jumped into the truck, started it, and pulled out fast, my tires throwing dirt everywhere. I drove for almost an hour before I stopped near a small ridge to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely light a cigarette. After I calmed down a little, I decided to take a quick look around before heading all the way back. I didn't know why. Maybe part of me wanted proof that I wasn't losing it. I walked a bit into the trees near where I'd stopped, and after a few minutes, I found something I'll never forget. There was a small makeshift camp, just a tarp tied between 2 trees, some food wrappers scattered around, and a few items that looked stolen. My missing water bottle, my half-empty can of beans. And right there, leaning against a tree, was my rifle. I felt this cold rush through my body, not from fear exactly, but from realization. Whoever had been there, whoever had been watching me, was still somewhere close. I didn't stick around to find out. I grabbed the rifle, sprinted back to the truck, and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't look back once. When I got home later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been inches away from something bad happening. I kept replaying everything. The sounds, the prints, the missing food, the shadow near the creek. Someone had been living out there, deep enough that nobody would find them. Maybe a drifter, maybe someone running from something. And I had camped right in their space without realizing it. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every sound outside made me jump. Even when I went hunting again months later, I couldn't bring myself to go alone. I stopped camping altogether after that trip. It's been years now, but I still remember that forest. The silence, the fog, the feeling that I was being watched. I never found out who that person was or what they were doing out there, and honestly, I don't want to. Sometimes when I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night, if I hadn't left when I did. I'll never know for sure, but I do know this. The woods can hold more than just animals. Sometimes the scariest thing you can find out there isn't a bear or a wolf. It's another person. Someone who's been living just far enough off the grid that the world forgot about them. Someone who doesn't want to be found.